Hi, welcome to the January 6th meeting of the Kubernetes VMware User Group, which addresses running all forms of Kubernetes on VMware infrastructure. It looks like we've got a little bit light attendance today just because this is a week that included a holiday in much of the world. But I've added a few items on the agenda, and then if we get through those and people want to chat about whatever, we can go ahead with that. Apologies in advance if I get background noise. My neighbor is having a roof replacement, so it seems quiet at the moment, but there have been outbursts of hammering and sawing and things breaking out over the past couple of days. Let me just share the agenda notes document and as I address the things I put on there. So just some updates related to vSphere, since this is about running Kubernetes on top of vSphere. The whole Log4j security issues seem to have gone out pretty big. By my observation, this thing is getting up there close to the old original Heartbleed in terms of how many things are out there with exposures, and vSphere is no exception. The company put out a blog post summary in mid-December, so I've got a link to it there. I'm not going to read it to you, but there's a lot of information in there. And the summary is that vSphere has some exposures as well as a lot of other collateral VMware products that are often used in conjunction with vSphere. There is a Q&A thread which is being updated periodically. I looked at it this morning, and the bottom line is that we're working on patches, but they're at this point in time, we can't say that there is a 100% comprehensive solution to address all aspects of the Log4j exposure in all products. So the Q&A thread, like I say, has the updates on the latest data. And then for the legalese summary, the source of truth, if some of these things are being updated at different speeds for other, is that CVE link itself, which is the third item in the list. It's independent of Log4j, but if you weren't aware of it, the vSphere ESXi 7 update 3 had some, we discovered some issues. It's been now removed from download. If you already have downloaded it and put it in service, it is still supported, but the plan is to come up with a newer future release of that update 3 that addresses the issues there. So I'd refer you to that blog for the summary of what's going on. And then just like in the Log4j, there is a frequently asked questions being maintained about that as well. Another thing that this isn't quite in the category of the first two items, but just making people aware, this is something that I took some time off at the holidays and updated my home lab and discovered that VMware has put out an advisory saying that we're going to deprecate booting ESXi hosts off of SD cards and USB devices, something that in an earlier era was popular. And I think there are legacy situations where pieces of hardware are booting off those devices. I know I had the things in my home lab. And part of the reason for this change is that the more recent releases of ESXi got a little more vigorous in their rights to log files. And by default, some of those could end up on these SD card and USB boot devices. If you're not aware, all forms of SSDs tend to have a phenomena where they can wear out. Too many writes to the flash memory cause it to eventually fail. It maybe gets worse over time, like some of the technologies that improve the storage density, like the quadruple layer cells, actually have less durability than the older single layer cell technology. They move to it because you can get much higher amounts of storage for a given price. But these SD cards and USB devices tend to use the cheapest available technology. So they are not, they're not like using enterprise SSDs in NVMe or SAS formats. They tend to be really cheap, failure prone things. And bottom line for my own personal story is I ended up doing my updates in my home lab, rebooting them and finding that indeed I had one of these devices wear out and the thing wouldn't reboot. So there's a decent summary there of what's involved, including a William Lamb blog post if you're on home lab scenarios like Intel NUCs, or in my case, I'm using kind of ancient Dell servers, but they come from that era where some of those were actually sold, from the factory with ESXi pre-installed on SD cards. So I think if you're running 5-year-old servers, there are definitely things out there like that. So anyway, just in case it's useful to people, I threw that out there. There was an update to the vSphere cloud provider that came out in December. It supports Kubernetes 1.22 and also has a number of bug fixes. And if you open that link, you can discover what the bug fixes are. The CSI storage plugin was not updated in December, but it was, I believe, updated. Maybe it was November or late October, but there has been update activity there with CSI, both a new version 2.4 and then some critical updates were released in some of the older versions of CSI as well. If anybody is out there still running those, I think that would commonly be a scenario of kind of being on a vendor platform with an older Kubernetes release that you don't want to take you want to kind of stick with the same thread of what you've got. And there are updates for those that address the issues disclosed at that link. And with that said, that's kind of all I brought to this meeting. So I'll open up the floor to anything people want to talk about, or if you have any questions about what I just talked about.
It's funny, you were talking about the NUCs running into exactly the same problem. USB sticks failing because the vSphere 7 boot banks are very write intensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a problem to reinstall ESX on every NUC, try and get everything working again.
Yeah. So I went through this same thing myself, and it isn't just the NUCs. Like I say, I've got like Dell 710s and things, and tried to investigate a bunch of solutions. For NUCs, the William Lamb article is good. And for that writing to logs frequently issue, once you've been burned and it wore out, it's kind of a little late to retroactively fix that problem. But you can go down to command line or PowerShell and move where the log file goes, so that it really, the boot process itself only needs to read that USB, which will not wear it out. You can read those as many times as you want. And you can actually, by default, the log file is on the same device as the boot, but it is possible to configure ESX to move the log to another device. And so if in your NUC you have got some kind of better storage than the USB, you can fairly easily move the thing there. It took me maybe 20 minutes to go find the knowledge base article on how to do it, and then make the command line calls to actually make it happen. And I did have to reboot a couple of times, I think, to to do this plus prove that it actually was working. But it wasn't too bad. I came to the conclusion that pretty much all of the USB keys you can buy these days are kind of trashy. You know, they've gone for price points. On SD cards, because people use them for professional cameras and photography. Now this, I don't think NUCs have SD cards, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't actually have a NUC myself. But in the flash cards, they have ratings of these things, and there are models that are specifically marked high endurance. So they put excess capacity there, anticipating that things will wear out. And I've also, I don't know whether, I saw blog articles with people alleging that buying a higher capacity device than what you need is a viable solution, but I don't know that I buy that. But you know, that the thing would, I can't see how it could steal from things that it could just as easily still be in use. But at least I saw somebody write a blog claiming that that was true. Maybe if you formatted it for less than the actual capacity, somehow the controller chip in there would know that you hadn't formatted it to use it all and use it for, you know, excess, but I don't know. Bottom line is you could buy cards that the manufacturer says are high endurance, and they actually quote
It's the
higher.
SSD trim.
Okay.
So
And-
if you have a large SSD, because it doesn't rewrite, like when you delete and write, it doesn't write on the same sector. So the trim spreads it out over all the sectors. So when you have
Okay.
a large capacity, it spreads it out. So you wear your nodes out over all of them. So they all wear at the same level. So when you do have a failure, it kind of like they all fail kind of at the same time.
Oh, okay, thanks.
So that's why the larger capacity lasts longer,
Uh-huh.
assuming that you are writing the same size. Now, if you're writing more data, it's going to wear faster, of course. But if you're like doing 1 gig, the 16 gig is going to last longer than the 4 gig drive.
Okay. So at least that might be sort of remedial so that you'll last longer before you get burned. And I did find on those SD cards, they have a bunch of rating systems. There's 3 of them. So you'll find old blogs that say class 10 is the best, but it turns out they kind of technology reached the pinnacle of the top rating of 10, and they started a new one that's a little U symbol. So I think a U3 is kind of the best tech for those SD cards now. And here's another one I think really would work, but unfortunately, at this point in time, vSphere kind of has, or ESXi has declared that all USB is kind of in this taboo, but you can actually buy little USB adapters. Let's see. Unfortunately, I have one, but I think it's away from my desk at the moment, or I'd hold it up to the camera. But it actually is like, it looks almost like a very fat USB flash device. And inside it will hold an NVMe actual SD drive, which should not have wear issues at all. You could actually even buy an enterprise grade one of those. And at least in the Dell 710s, I believe that would actually physically fit, because the USB, they have a USB socket inside the chassis that has plenty of room. And if you were to move to one of those that where you're actually using a legit SD drive instead of kind of these consumer flash drives, I think that thing could effectively last decades. There actually are, if you have room, Amazon actually has these little USB adapters that go from USB to a SATA connector. And I think once again, you could put, if you had the physical room, you could connect those to a SATA SSD, or actually even a SATA rotating media drive would probably have more durability, even if the speed was horrible. So
Yeah, that's
anyway,
what I have
Robert,
hooked
I
up.
think you could move your log files off of those SSDs if you have any decent storage at all inside those NUCs, and potentially also use a USB gateway adapter to get it to an actual SSD drive.
Yeah, you can also do what I did, which is just write all the logs to dev null in my home lab.
Oh,
It's
okay.
not great for debugging, but at least you don't have storage issues.
Yeah. The other thing
That
that's
was
in that,
something I was gonna say was you could store your logs to the RAM disk. So I mean,
Yeah.
as long as you don't reboot, but then you could also set up like a sys logger somewhere. So
yeah.
there you go.
Yeah, that blog post actually has another workaround of booting off the network. And then, of course, you could use an external syslog or something. So there might be some solutions, but it's just in a home lab. If it's a chicken and egg, you know, like I have a log insight log server, but the thing is it's hosted on the ESX itself. So if the ESX goes down, that isn't going to do any good for the log.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
more
I'm
than
actually
one
using some
ESXi
of those.
server, right?
Oh, pardon me. I think two people talked and I didn't hear what was said.
I was just saying you have more than one ESXi server. So if your log insight goes down, it boots up on the other.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
What I don't have is decent. Well, we don't need to get into thorough details of my home lab, but I don't have a good shared storage solution just because of,
It's expensive.
yeah, the networking backbone is expensive for that. So I have shared storage on 1 gig E, but that's kind of pitiful.
Right.
So anyway, opening up the floor to anything else people want to talk about, even including nominations for meetings, future meetings of this group. Another thing that I'll ask for help on is that the KubeCon Europe is coming up. And I know at least, Robert, you are in Europe. And Scott, I don't know if where you are is considered Europe or not, but close enough. It's probably closer to Europe than the other KubeCon sites. That will be May 14. And at least for now, that is planned as a physical event only with no remote attendance in Valencia, Spain. And I think this group is likely to submit a CFP for some topic to be covered. If anybody here has suggestions for what you'd like to see there, or even if you'd like to volunteer to be part of a presentation at that event, I'm open to ideas.
Yeah, I already have a CFP in, and you're only allowed to speak at one event at KubeCon, one
Okay.
talk. So I can't. I'm doing one on Carvel, hopefully, if that gets accepted. Carvel and TCE. But yeah, and I think, you know, hopefully I will be there live, COVID allowing, and we'll definitely attend the meeting. That's for sure.
Yeah, I'd love to be there, but I'm not gonna bet on it.
Yeah. Well, if you think it's you know, approaching 50% likely, we could go for it anyway. I mean, with COVID, I don't think anybody knows with 100% certainty what might happen. But yeah, let me know. And even if you can't be there yourself, if you've got ideas for, my trouble is I've been putting on these sessions year after year, and eventually you run out of ideas. And I'd rather have ideas generated by prospective audience members than me, because it's kind of hard. It's a guessing game if you're guessing what people are interested in, rather than having actual audience members tell you flat out what they'd like to learn about.
Yeah, I think the yeah, I don't know. I haven't really been thinking about KubeCon, but I mean, topics we've discussed on in this forum before are which would always be interesting are what we talked about before, like availability. You know, basically the full stack of how you build highly available Kubernetes solutions. In this case, involving you know, the VMware's flavors of Kubernetes distributions, but the basic principles are broader. I mean, that's an idea. I'm not sure if I would be ready to participate myself in something like that, but that's something I'd certainly want to see, a talk like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'd kind of like to put that together too, but there's different levels where, you know, I think the big challenge to which, unfortunately, there yet to be invented great solutions is the whole thing of drilling down through the layers of complexity there to get to root cause analysis and to have the thing be a little smarter about putting together things at these different abstraction layers that you've got going on. A session on it could do sort of, I don't know, there's still value in it, but I describe it as superficial to go at it like a user panel where people are more or less summarizing the pain points. But kind of the more valuable one, if you could pull it off, would be something maybe getting into an intro on the pain points and actually coming up with solutions.
Yeah. But just, I mean, even just creating awareness about how to architect systems like that, because as we've discussed before, right, most people only have they only have a visibility on a single slice of the stack. But yeah, I mean, yeah, like what we talked about with Miles last time. You know, it'd be nice if we had like a bunch of cookbooks on how to build, you know, a set of standard solutions, but require a bit more effort before you could give a talk like that and actually give that kind of value add.
Yeah. Even the first step, if you've got any ideas for nominating, a cookbook sort of implies that you've got some common patterns of use cases. You know, there are some that are much larger scales than others. What you do for kind of a remote branch office is a little different from what you do for a full on-prem data center. And if you could pigeonhole them into those, it would help. And then if you've got the luxury of having something that maybe spans cross regions, so that part of your disaster recovery could entail standing up replacement resources in another location. In other words, you're implementing concepts of like regions. That's a different scenario than people who aren't running at a scale large enough to, you know, to envision that.
I assume that TCE will be a project in the ecosystem that VMware is going to want to have, going to show off at KubeCon quite heavily, because it's such a community-oriented, open part of the Tanzu ecosystem. It's a very good match for the kind of community that you get at KubeCon. So I'm assuming there'll be lots of TCE presence, as it were, at KubeCon. And just, I mean, you know, I can certainly imagine Scott doing a Carvel session there. That seems like a obvious one, right?
Yeah. I think we anticipate doing that, but under the current, the CNCF rules, it isn't yet accepted as a sandbox project. And you can't do that when when an open source thing first goes out, it isn't automatically eligible.
Okay.
You have to have outside contributors. It has to have a certain critical mass. They do an analysis of what they call the health of the open source project that is based on a bunch of criteria that, you know, they don't want vendors just putting a brand label on something saying now open source, and then it instantly becomes eligible for CNCF. And because it isn't there yet, there are some rules that prevent the scope of how much presence it can have in kind of the official sessions and things.
Yeah.
I'm anticipating, I don't even know if it's been decided yet, but I'm guessing that VMware will have a booth, and at a minimum, it would be there. But yeah, I think we aspire to it getting a little broader exposure. But in terms of having actual official sessions on the session agenda, because it isn't right now under the CNCF, I don't think it's eligible for doing that.
Yeah. It's
Yeah,
kind of,
I think,
go
go ahead. No, I think the one other subject that could be interesting to deal with is that we've talked about here also a bit is the challenges or the things to note with Kubernetes and air gap scenarios. And that's something that is relatively specific to vSphere, although it is a bit broader because there are, for example, AWS environments that cut off access to the internet. But much more in the vSphere world, that is a common scenario where you have limited internet access, whether that be proxy networks or completely air gapped. And that brings its own challenges to the Kubernetes world.
Yeah, you're right. That is a great topic. It's almost like now I'm sorry that the general CFP window is closed, because you're right, it is broader than just vSphere, but given that vSphere is so popular when you go on-prem, that is a common scenario of just network considerations, standing up a container image repository, managing to come up with a scenario to still get patches done and things.
Right. How do you still utilize the velocity of the open source community of Helm charts that are being released by Bitnami or anyone else on a weekly basis? A new version is out there, but how do you deal with the cycles of how do you bring that into your environment? How do you deal with all of this when you're in a air gap scenario is a complex challenge that there are tools out there, open source tools that help. But there's never been, that I have found at least, a good session or blog post or anything that really goes into depth on what the correct methodology is. And I think that as VMware is the most prevalent for these types of cases as a platform to run on, could be something that would be interesting to have in the VMware user group session, that you may also be able to attract people that aren't necessarily just running on vSphere, right? If the session topic comes out, you may be able to get a wider audience of people to join, because when we go down availability, that's specific only vSphere, right?
Yeah.
And I know we are the VMware user group and we want to get VMware users, but also just getting more traction is always a good thing. And this would possibly attract a larger audience.
Yeah, and it isn't just air gap now that I think about it. This has come up in meetings of this user group before. We've got a user with a big retailer who has the scenario where they do have network connectivity, but it's bad. It isn't 100% reliable. It isn't high bandwidth. And they have scenarios where they want to take a power cycling, come back, and maybe when they come back, the network is down, but they want that store to come back and be online, which, sort of implies things like any containers have to have local sources rather than fresh pulls off the internet. I also have heard users with cruise lines where they have a scenario where these cruise ships actually have a lot of IT equipment on them. They, even multiple racks where they're running accounting and billing systems, entertainment systems, and gambling machine operations. And they get connectivity only when the ship comes into port. And then it can go a week or more out at sea with no connectivity. And it's similar to air gapped, but maybe not 100% identical. But, there are some real interesting challenges there for how you'd come up with a system that would meet your requirements. And so, yeah, I appreciate that. That's a good idea. And I think that would actually resonate with a pretty broad potential audience.
Yeah, no, for sure. And we're currently working, myself and a few other people, on opening up another kind of like user group specifically for on-premise Kubernetes, for like air gap solutions. And I've collected a bunch of, tools that help with this and a bunch of just like data. I would be more than, if this is a subject that is, that whatever, if it's decided that this is a subject, I can definitely share some thoughts and whatever the notes that I have and the resources that I have collected, that I have found useful in this type of use case.
Okay, yeah,
with whoever
appreciate
relevant.
that. That'd be great. But yeah, it's interesting that kind of air gapped on-prem, and then I described the cruise ship as mobile. And
Right.
I've heard people dreaming of things like Kubernetes in an automobile. Not sure I buy it yet, given the limited resource there, but who knows? Compute capacity tends to grow over time. And even if it isn't viable on a cheap consumer automobile, maybe it's viable on a larger truck or other mobile vehicle that might have some interesting issues like that too.
Yeah, I mean, there are already, you look at the amount of compute power that's going into a Tesla or to any of these new cars. I mean, K3S or other distributions that are these lightweight distributions of Kubernetes definitely could run on, those small systems even, right? The question is then reliability and things like that. And, there are some complexities, obviously, of using Kubernetes there. But I don't think we're that far away with these lightweight Kubernetes distributions like K3S that run as a single binary. I'm not sure we're that far off from that happening, actually.
Yeah.
And that brings its own complexities, obviously.
So anybody else got anything, any topics you want to chat about? Throw it out there.
Well, I was kind of thinking about what's going to happen this year when it comes to the Kubernetes VMware landscape, because I think it's going to be an interesting year for a whole bunch of reasons. And what I really like right now is you're seeing a rapid maturing of parts of the Tanzu portfolio, and the politics inside the MapBU, which is gonna mean that there's gonna be a more solid narrative around VMware and Kubernetes and everything that goes on top of it this year. And I'm seeing, remember, I'm from a partner, right? So I'm always thinking about kind of our customers and what we're seeing happening. And there's a lot of, there is a lot of kind of noise, right? There's a lot of interest in all of the cloud native topics. No one really knows how to deal with it. Up till, up till last year, I've been a bit hesitant about saying, dive into the newer Kubernetes distributions VMware is offering, because it's still very much in being built up. Now this year that seems to be changing. We're reaching points where the value add is starting to outweigh the immaturity. And personally, I've got a bunch of POCs lined up with customers, which I'm really looking forward to. What needs to happen, and God knows we've covered this before, is a bit of education and a bit of getting that infra up going when it comes to these kinds of technologies. This is what I really loved about TCE, because it's it's an open community. Anyone can join in, right? Anyone can participate in that part of the VMware ecosystem around Kubernetes. And that's going to hopefully help incentivize a lot of interest. And it's a great way of, when I'm talking to people, saying, look, just look at that for now, right? You don't need to invest in a bunch of hardware, set it aside for a PSC. Just download TCE. Start. Have a look at just how easy VMware is making it to install stuff into Kubernetes with Carvel. It's just built into the Tanzu command line. Yeah, Helm is easy, but this is also easy. And look at this ecosystem that they're building.
For this group, I'm just going to interrupt you a bit. That this group, because we're under this CNCF charter, we're specifically advised that this is about all vendors Kubernetes, including people who don't use a commercial distro or who use Rancher or Red Hat. So a lot of what you're talking about is a stack, and I believe you could use Carvel. Carvel is that is under CNCF to run on other forms of Kubernetes that aren't even Tanzu. But I appreciate the words that a lot of the complexity for users is just that it's almost like at one point, Linux was a thing, but it got commoditized. I think Kubernetes itself is more or less getting commoditized, or that's the path it's on. But an actual user who's going to use this for practical things needs to worry about the applications on top of it and along with it. And maybe at some point, Kubernetes disappears into invisibility. So this concept that you have a complete stack of things that work together is a key thing to making this practical to deploy.
Yeah, and so many parts of that Tanzu stack are going to break out into the open source community this year.
Mm-hmm.
Going to be part of that TCE stack. So it's that it just creates a huge amount of opportunity and a way in that's really, the barrier to entry is so much lower if it's not immediately a commercial offering, right? So that it makes my job easy, but it also means that user groups like this, all the communities evolving around these open source projects, around where this Tanzu ecosystem, they're all they're the perfect way to get into this stuff. I wonder
if you have the experience. My trouble is I've worked on Kubernetes so long, I'm like an insider and almost know too much. And at some point, you'd think that this could be good enough that someone with zero background in Kubernetes, but is familiar with an app development platform, should be able to get by with minimal understanding and investment and just get things to work. How close do you think we are to that point right now? Realistically,
not too close to that yet.
Oh, I think we're very close. With exactly, Robert, why I'm saying that we're very close. But I think that in the end, with the currently beta, when it becomes GA idea of Tanzu application platform and whatnot, which again, that's a commercial offering. But I think the general idea, there was a great article that I know Robert's been sharing around also, and written by a close friend actually from VMware here in Israel, Oded Chopin, who used to be a Cloud Foundry guy. So the idea of a PaaS, right? When we looked at the beginning of containers and all of that, it was very difficult, the idea of writing applications at that point. And then you had the PCFs or the Herokus or whatever came out with the idea of a PaaS system. And that's coming to Kubernetes as well. Whether that be VMware's offering or other offerings that are out there, things like Cartographer, which is an open source project. All of these tools, I think that what people are finally understanding is what Kelsey Hightower posted, I think in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, which is that Kubernetes is not the end game. It's a platform for platforms. It's just a good place to start from. And I think that people are starting to realize that, and that platforms are being built above it. Which allows what you're talking about, Steve, right? If we look at even Knative, which, right, a huge open source project on top of Kubernetes, still required writing a bunch of YAML, creating Docker files, doing all of that. They have a sandbox project called Funk that allows you to basically just give function code and it builds out a Knative service and everything for you. You don't need to know about Kubernetes. So that's like an open source system for certain types of applications. And then you have Argo CD, and you've got all these different tools that are kind of starting to come together in the community that are really building these platforms on top of Kubernetes that are abstracting it all away. And I think that the key with Kubernetes that I think people are starting to realize in the community is that if your developers need to have raw access to kubectl and use it on a daily basis, you're doing something wrong. Your developers should not need to be with kubectl on a daily basis. They should have some level of abstraction, whether that be homegrown or a commercial offering or an open source tool that deals with the complexities for them. Because there's too many knobs in Kubernetes that to teach a developer who needs to know multiple programming languages, also YAML, infrastructure, storage, networking, everything. We've already realized that full stack development doesn't really work that well. And that front-end developers are better at front-end than full stack are, and back-end developers are better at back-end than full stack developers. We tried that, it moved back. I think the same thing is going to go with Kubernetes. It's got such a wide spread that we need these other platforms. And I think that we are getting there. And this year is going to be big with that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It almost seems like it has a feel like, to use a historical precedent, IT evolved in, I don't know, the 90s through the early 2000s into the scenario where enterprises had DBAs and database specialists, they had network specialists, they had storage specialists, and they became people who had that deep knowledge that got called in when you had to go make a major architectural purchase decision and when you had to troubleshoot when things went horribly wrong. But for the most part, individual developers were not called upon to do that, or maybe they weren't even given the admin credentials to touch the things related to the databases, the network, the storage. And maybe eventually that's the way Kubernetes goes, where enterprises have a handful of Kubernetes specialists, but it isn't expected to be an across the board skill that everybody in the IT infrastructure would have.
Right. You'll have a platform team that is in charge of the platform, be that Kubernetes is the infrastructure, and then above that, whatever platform tooling you're using above that to expose it to your developers. And it'll be just like databases as a commodity or networking as a commodity, that the developer can say, yeah, I need this port open to here. He doesn't need to know what that means in terms of what 7 firewalls along the way that needs to be opened in and what VLANs need to be created or whatever needs to be done. That's all dealt with by the experts, or in today's world, by automation, hopefully.
Yeah, so this is where I see the challenge. I think we still have a bit of a way to go before we can get there. I still see too much fragmentation in standards and skill sets and tools around getting to that point.
Well, Robert, I know you threw out the idea of having a cookbook with templates, but maybe the templates aren't just technology, but templates making recommendations for how people structure their organization in terms of, you need to have these teams with these specialties. And
so this is kind of literally what my job is with customers, is kind of developing those kind of policies like that and ideas like that. But just to take a step back to the technology. I mean, if we look at automation to get stuff done, so I'm not talking about the developers. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Scott that you want developers to just be able to focus on code. You don't want them. You want to give them that high level abstraction, so they don't need to deal with the infrastructure. But the moment you get to the what we're calling the platform team, things are really messy out there right now, and this worries me. And I think we have a lot of work there. If you think of processes around automating, say, firewalls, I mean, some companies are trying to adopt frameworks around automating this stuff, sometimes with Terraform. If it's from the VMware ecosystem, it's often with vRealize automation. I don't get the impression that many companies are being particularly successful with that stuff. We still, it comes back to the skill thing again. We need a lot of people infra up, where they'll adopt using tools, higher level infrastructure automation tools like Terraform or Ansible, things like that, to be able to enable that stuff. You can't successfully implement higher level platforms if you can't get rid of the problem of programmatically putting in a firewall rule somewhere. And this may just be the lens through our through the customers I see in the Netherlands. But many of these companies aren't there yet. They're still doing firewall rules manually. They're still setting, building VMs manually. I mean, it's a long tail, right? So you're gonna have companies that at some point manage to get to a certain level. I mean, within the Kubernetes hype cycle, we like talking about the tip of the spear, but it's not what I see when I look at the market. So it's, the long tail is getting broader, it's getting higher, and as many people, many companies, especially newer companies, are kind of being built up with some of this cloud native thinking already embedded in their people. A lot of people are still being left behind, and it's still going to be a huge challenge to get to the level where if you have to solve some of those underlying problems first before you can get to the point. Okay, now we have the foundation to say, let's do a higher level, developer platform, say like Cloud Foundry or TAP or something like that. The groundwork is not in place culturally and from a skills perspective in many companies, unfortunately. So the sand moves under your feet all the time when it comes to the open source community. So so like for the average, kind of vSphere admin or person that comes from infra, a lot of them aren't even bothering to try and keep up because it's moving too fast. So it's very hard. One of the things I try to recommend to kind of middle management is you guys have to strategically invest in skilling people up and giving the room that people can actually start investigating some of these newer technologies. Right, the next project you do when it comes to a big implementation, don't do the firewalling by hand in NSXT. Use Terraform. Just use this project as an opportunity to get to a higher level of automation. As I'm not seeing it enough, and it makes me a little bit skeptical about how fast we can move in this space. Rant over. Hope it didn't depress everyone.
No, I'm seeing things a bit differently here, but then again, the Israeli market is known as very ahead of adopting technology very fast and very early. For good and for bad. I will say for bad for a lot of things as well, because they adopt technologies before they're mature enough. But that's just I think it is definitely market specific. But that's also where, when I have seen customers that are like that, that's where you don't go in with Kubernetes, I think, at day one. I think that Kubernetes or anything in the modern application world needs to come along with cultural change, and the cultural change needs to come first. Otherwise, it will be a failed implementation of modern applications. And that's where I think things like a VCF stack or things like that, which again, just taking the VMware infrastructure, being programmatic, having that capability, you then need to build it from the ground up. You can't just, unfortunately, in today's world, everyone goes according to buzzwords. So I'm there's a very famous meme of someone that went to VMworld, a CTO who goes to VMworld and he comes in saying Kuber what? And he walks out saying, great, I need a multi-cluster service mesh. They start with what's a container and get all I know everything needs to be done in steps. And I think that one of the issues is that people try to rush because of the buzzword into we need Kubernetes everywhere without even understanding that they need to break down monolithic applications into microservices. The amount of times I've seen containers that are macro services, it's a monolith that's just tied up into a container, and does not know how to scale and does not follow, it follows 0 of the 12 factors of an application that there's supposed to be, is, a sad fact of life. And therefore, I think in those cases, Kubernetes is not the right solution at this point. It's a goal to get to, but implementing Kubernetes at such a place is not the right step. It needs to be cultural within the legacy applications, and then moving towards Kubernetes. Otherwise, it just will be too much to handle at once.
Yeah, what I do like about the hype cycle is that it pushes on all levels, right? So vendors are starting to release their software in container form, and frameworks that developers use, the default at some point becomes a Helm chart instead of a bunch of VMs, and that's when you start to notice the pressure coming from the other side. Yeah, that's when then your Kubernetes platform that that is being minimally used, suddenly developer groups start approaching you saying, look, we have this thing, and they gave us a bunch of containers, and we don't know what to do with this. Please help us. I think for the next few years, that's going to be the level, right? That's going to be the level that a huge amount of people are going to be introduced to Kubernetes first, is at that level. So we're not talking application platforms, right? We're not talking that high level of automation. We're talking about, I built this in Docker. It's kind of 12-factor, but not really. Please help me run it in Kubernetes because I hear that's better than Docker. That's the level we're at right now, I think. And we're going to stay there for a while. And then hopefully, because of all these pressures coming from all these different directions, the floor keeps rising slowly, right? And the challenge right now is a lot of enterprises want they want a Kubernetes platform because they see this coming, right? They kind of see like, oh, we have a bunch of developer groups. They're really enthusiastic about this new stuff. We need some kind of Kubernetes platform to host these people. They're not thinking about application platform. They're thinking about, we need a place to run the containers, and we don't want to have a bunch of separate Docker hosts.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, Robert, just because having worked in the past for ISVs, I think it's true that pretty much all of those who are selling a software product, even in the old days of VMs, they didn't want to deal with certifying it on a zillion different vendors' bare metal servers. So they ended up insisting that it go into vSphere VMs. And now those people, if they have a brain, they insist that it goes in a Docker container, because who wants to take the support calls for poor dependency support and things? And the in-house apps will discover that that's smart to do for your in-house apps as well. But kind of some of the laggards in the adoption cycle are still getting there. But I think you're right that everything goes containerized.
Yeah, and you're going to see the same with low-code frameworks. I have a bunch of customers that are kind of in the geo space. So you see a lot of geo frameworks like Air and stuff like that, or R, I should say. And these are very kind of open source driven low code frameworks, and you're seeing that whole community is moving over to doing it in containers, but they're doing it in Docker first, because a lot of these people are just doing it on their laptops, and they're doing shadow IT because the enterprises therein don't have a Kubernetes platform yet, right? So you do see that pressure starting to come, but it's all extremely low level, right? It's not very complex, and it's developers and analysts leading that push, and not, there's no policy around it yet. So it is. I can see it's coming. It's just not coming as fast as you might like. And I feel that especially the vendors making Kubernetes distributions they're over here, right? They're on the other side of that divide, and there's this huge gap in between. But yeah, another point I can't remember, but it's my point. It's going to take longer than you think if you just attended KubeCon.
You know, speaking of that, and maybe Scott's seeing this in terms of bleeding edge. When I went to the last KubeCon, kind of the cool kids in the hallway track were all talking about WebAssembly as kind of the next version of container. And I don't imagine the laggards are onto that yet, but you know, the WebAssembly concept is that it's sort of like a Docker container, but the code is portable and runs everywhere. And the founder of Docker is quoted as saying, gee, if WebAssembly had existed back when we designed Docker, we wouldn't have needed to do Docker. So
yeah. I think that, you know, the one thing I can say, Robert, also is, you know, the one thing that we have seen as success in those types of customers as well in the past was, you know, something that we've used in many different approaches as well, and different, you know, technology hurdles like this, where there's the lack of knowledge or whatever, is to actually never try and do it in a brownfield. Always do a greenfield for Kubernetes, let's say, or greenfield for the new technology, because you get rid of most of the complexities. You put it in a new cluster, you put it in a new place, new networking stack, whatever it is. In many cases, that's possible because you're starting small. And then you say, great, you want to move to this new environment, you're using new methodologies. So you don't affect the current platform. You don't try and put in modern application methodologies into a legacy workload environment. You create the new environment and say, here we work programmatically, here we work declaratively. And then anyone that wants to use that platform or manage that platform, you have a small platform team that's a breakout from the current platform team for the legacy applications, that are the people that want to learn and that are eager to learn these new technologies. And they manage this new environment that is small at the beginning, so they can start with a small team. And developers that want to adopt the new technologies and gain the brand new hardware that we just acquired with awesome new capabilities, great, use our new methodologies. Or you can continue using legacy, use the 5-year-old servers that are here that are running on SD cards that vSphere is going to break on at some point because it's going to run out of writes, and, you know, be happy there. But I think that separation of give the choice. You want to work legacy, you want to work new, but it's separate environments. That way you don't need to try and change all of the business's culture at once as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah. Oh, you're muted, Steve.
I think we've reached our hour-long length of this meeting. So I'll give people a final chance for any parting words, and otherwise we'll wrap it up and see you again in a month.
I just wanted to wish you a Happy New Year, Steve.
Okay.
And,
Yeah, same to you. Happy New Year.
Yeah. Happy New Year, everyone. And by the way, in February, I will be doing a talk on air-gapped Kubernetes stuff with Carvel. For anyone that's interested, it'll be after the next meeting, and I'll have a link by then, hopefully, because that's relevant to this group. But I'll be doing that on Tanzu Tuesday on some air-gapped Kubernetes stuff that's not relevant to only VMware distributions. So anyone that's running Kubernetes.
I'd like to hear that. So when the more details are available, if you can drop it in the Slack channel or something, that'd be great.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I too will be on a Tanzu Tuesdays with the VM Vanguard group. And we're going to talk, what are we talking about again? We're going to talk about something.
Anyway, I'll invite you to throw it in the
no?
Slack channel too, because I'll try
Next
to be
week, Robert, right?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think you're next week. I'm the week after, and then 2 weeks after that, and 2 weeks after that again. So exactly. Well,
okay. Well, I'll see all of you soon then.
Tuesdays. Sounds good.
Bye.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Again, this was great.
All right.
guys. Bye.
Thanks.